It's been over 500 years since Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the church doors one October day. And I'm sure that you heard the story like I did growing up. This guy took a hammer and a big nail, and it always looked like this giant railroad spike to me, and just hammered away on a church door to make them read his statement on all the things that were wrong with the Catholic Church. Now, like many big points in history, there are sometimes tall tales that surround these things. In the case of Luther, many of us heard that this act of nailing these statements to the church doors sparked the Reformation. The Reformation brought us the Protestant church, which is where both Unitarians and Universalists come out of. But is this the case? Things are not always what they seem. So, who was this Luther, and why do we care? Well, we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson that I promise will be quick. Martin Luther lived in Germany in the early 16th century during a time when the Catholic Church was known for its practice of selling indulgences to raise money. An indulgence was a payment that someone made to the church to purchase an exemption from punishment or penance for some types of sins, basically buying your way out of hell or purgatory instead of doing acts of penance. Now, Luther was a theologian, an academic, and an Augustinian monk. He believed that salvation could only be reached by faith and divine grace, not by works, as the Catholic Church was stating, and he was opposed to the selling of indulgences, really opposed to it. So, since he was an academic, he did what academics in his day and today still do. He wrote down his opposition. The 95 Theses, though, were not the first ones he wrote. In fact, he wrote another set of questions for debate, for this is what the theses were, and delivered them to his university. And they were ignored. So he wrote the quote, Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. That's the actual title of the 95 Theses, and delivered them to the Wittenberg Castle Church. Now, the story is that he hammered them into the door, people saw them, and boom, the Reformation happened. Not exactly. You see, the 95 Theses were written in Latin. The Wittenberg Castle Church was in Germany. The people, for the most part, did not read Latin. The 95 Theses were not for them. They were for the church fathers. The theses were an invitation to have a conversation or a debate. In fact, translated, the beginning of the theses begins as such. Quote, out of love for the truth and from desire to elucidate it, the Reverend Father Martin Luther, Master of Arts and Sacred Theology and ordinary lecturer therein at Wittenberg, intends to defend the following statements and to dispute them in that place. Therefore, he asks that those who cannot be present and dispute with him orally shall do so in their absence by letter. Rather formal, but it's an invitation for the church fathers to either be present for the debate or send their remarks in writing. Now remember, Luther was an academic, and this is what they did. And academics still do this. But this wasn't just a list of everything Luther felt the church was doing wrong. He wanted to start a conversation. The theses included biblical notes to cite his positions, but they also asked questions. He truly wanted a conversation. So, how did a simple invitation to debate 95 points of theology end up sparking the Reformation? Well, let's first talk about whether or not he actually drove nails into a church door. There is some debate about that. According to History.com, Luther more than likely simply tacked the document on the door of the church very matter-of-factly to announce the upcoming debate, like on a bulletin board. Not quite as dramatic, is it? But for me, the dramatic part is what happened next. Remember, these statements were in Latin, so people walked by this document and likely didn't bat an eye, until someone did. Someone, and who it is has been lost to history, someone took that document down and translated it into German, the language of the people. Suddenly, everyone could read these statements and circulate them. The 95 Theses, to use the parlance of today, went viral. They suddenly made their way across Germany and then eventually to Rome, which caused a problem for Luther. In 1518, the Pope condemned his writings as conflicting with the teachings of the Church. Oops, that's not really a conversation, is it? In 1519, the Papal Commission declared them to be heretical, but the second simply said they were, quote, scandalous and offensive to pious ears. Ouch. Still no conversation. In 1520, The Pope condemned his propositions as heretical and ordered Luther to recant. He had 120 days to recant. Again, the Pope was not interested in having a debate or conversation with Luther, which is what Luther wanted. No, the Pope wanted Luther to recant his words. Luther didn't want to recant. So in 1521, Luther was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And that's the interesting thing, right? The thing we sometimes forget in the history. Luther was a Catholic, and he saw things that weren't right and said, hey, wait a minute. But here's the other interesting thing. Luther had no real part in the Reformation that followed. He didn't set out to start a movement. He set out to address issues he saw. He did what he could, where he could, how he could. And then it took someone else fanning the spark to make it catch fire. This story stuck with me the day I heard it because of that, because of the accidental Reformation. Because someone who could read Latin, and I assume was not one of the church fathers, although maybe it was, thought more people need to know about this and made that happen. Because someone took the time to translate 95 theological statements from Latin to German. Because someone handed that translation to someone else, who handed it to someone else, who handed it to someone else. Because even when hauled before the Pope and his councils, Luther didn't back down. He refused to recant, even when faced with excommunication. Because of that act, the Protestant Reformation started. And because the Protestant Reformation started, we, as Unitarian Universalists, are here today. British historian George Chrysides says that, quote, perhaps the best way to understand the Unitarians is to view them as products of the Protestant Reformation. It was that first questioning that made room for many different changes in Christianity at the time. Many new Christian movements and organizations began in Europe, and Unitarianism grew out of that. Universalism came out of the later movements within the Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptists, the Pietists, and the rejection of Calvinistic theology. Jack Mendelson says, quote, to their everlasting credit, our Universalist forebears were lifting their voices against the cruel myth of hell and preaching that a good and perfect God created humans to grow eternally in the goodness of their Creator. Now, again, it goes back to Luther and going further back, Augustine, and the thought that people are saved by faith and grace and not by works. So this is part of who we are, the questioning, the wondering, the whole, hey, this doesn't feel right. So who are we now? And why does Luther matter now? We are known and have been known as the denomination that has been vocal about the issues here in our country, the human rights issues, the environmental issues, the systemic white supremacy in our culture. The issues are so big, so complex, so hard to find a way to dismantle and topple. It's easy to think there's too much for any one person to do to make any real change. And I'll admit, there are times I think the same thing. Especially now when the orders and directions are coming rapid fire and it's hard to know what's going to stick, what's meant to distract, and what's really going on. Sometimes it seems that all we're doing is nailing our thoughts to the doors, stating, here is what we believe, let us talk about this, trying to have conversations with people who can affect real change. The problem is that the people who need to hear us appear to be ignoring us. How many times do we hear of representatives and senators refusing to come to town hall meetings, or how emails bounced back and voicemails were full and faxes couldn't get through? How many of us feel like we're shouting into the abyss on social media or in our day-to-day lives? Do we shrug and stop and decide if no one is listening, we should just be quiet? No. We keep talking, keep writing, keep calling, keep posting, keep trying to have the conversations. We never know who will be the one to witness our words and boost the signal. We may not need our words translated for the people. I hope we don't. But someone may read or hear what we say, and it may be what they need to fan that spark into a flame. I've been watching over the last 2 weeks that have felt like a century. There are groups forming. There are brave people who are willing to say, no, I need you to hear me about what is happening. There are others who are boosting those signals. Everyone will have a role to play in the upcoming days. And I promise you, based on the conversations I'm participating in, there is work being started. The theses are being written. Know that there will be a need for those who can take that information and get it to as many people as possible who might not otherwise be able to read or hear it. And there will be a need to protect those sparks, a need to take those sparks and run with them. It's hard work and it's scary. And yet my hope is that I can take a spark and fan it into a flame to boost the signal for those who might not be aware of what is happening, to amplify that there are things wrong here that we need to have a conversation about and then work to solve. Those little sparks, those are what will go viral. Those are what will help us find new ways to reach people, to change systems, to make this world a better place. Those sparks are the fire of love, the fire of commitment, the sparks from our own chalice flame that we light and extinguish each week to remind us of our connection to the larger Unitarian Universalist community and the world, the light that we carry out into the world. May our sparks help fan the flames of others. May we work hard to continue to have the conversations, to fight the good fight, and to never back down from what we know to be right in this world. Amen. Blessed be, and may it be so.